Welcome to SysEng Quick. My name is John, and today we're going to continue working on our refactor of the Proxmox collection. We'll learn a little bit about making custom lookup plugins and custom action plugins along the way. Let's get started. In VS Code, I've opened the Cloud Image Defaults file, and I've commented out all of our old defaults and replaced it with this Cloud Image Name property. So these default variables do work, and you could supply your own base URL, checksum, and cloud image file to get a different image when you want to build a different server. But that's a terrible user experience. I'd like to do a little bit better. I want to supply just the name of the distro, maybe with a version, and have something in Ansible look up the information I want and then download that image. So I've made an argument specs file, and we've made the cloud image dest thing that we already have and our new cloud image name property. It's a string type and it's got a few values here. You can say we've defined 3 different distros so far. We've got Fedora 40, we've got Rocky 9.4, and Ubuntu 2404. And you can see we've defined them in multiple ways. So Ubuntu will be the latest version of Ubuntu. We'll have the Ubuntu with the version, and then if it has a code word, we'll have something like that. This will make it very easy for people to know what they're using. So we're going to default to whatever the latest Ubuntu is. But for now, we'll go ahead and figure out how to download just any of these files. To do that, we're going to create a custom lookup plugin. A lookup plugin allows us to, look up data. And we've seen this with the file lookup plugin and the environment variables lookup plugin. We can make our own plugin to supply something like Fedora and get back things like our image URL for the checksum and the files. So let's go ahead and start that. Let's open the File Explorer. We'll go to the Plugins folder inside our Proxmox collection. We'll make a new file here under Lookup, and we're going to give it the name that we want to call our plugin. I'm going to call this Cloud Image Files, and we'll end it with a Python extension. So this is a Python file, and to start off, I'm going to copy a sample lookup plugin from Ansible. So this is the file lookup plugin. So to start out, I just want to change this copyright information, and every lookup plugin needs to start with this from future import annotations. This is actually a recent change with Ansible 2.17, but it works for 2.16. It's more about the Python version you're using than the Ansible version. But this is the new standard, so even though it's not quite out yet, I'm going to go ahead and go with from future import annotations and make our code a bit future-proof. Similarly to when we had the custom module, I don't want any of these variables defined in my Python file. I know it is the Ansible standard, but I don't like it, and there is an alternative that I'm going to take advantage of. Let's ignore these imports right now. We will come back to them later, and we'll probably remove some of the ones we don't use. But for every lookup module or lookup plugin, you need to define a class called lookup module, and it must be named lookup module. It inherits from lookup base, which is from Ansible plugins lookup. Inside your class, you need to define at least one method, the run method, and it must have this signature. So here's how we define how we're going to run a lookup plugin. It is given a list of terms. We'll only have one, but you could have a list if you're looking up multiple things. We won't be, but you could. You can supply variables and keyword args to a plugin as well. Again, we're not doing that in this plugin, but you could. So let's go ahead and start. The first thing I want to do is make a YAML file which has all the data I want to put in here. So in our defaults, we had things like the image base, the checksum file, and the image file. I want to make a YAML file defining that information. That'll make it easier for someone trying to update this. They won't have to change our Python code or make some kind of Python dictionary. In my opinion, that's harder to read, so we're going to import it from YAML. There'll be an additional benefit that we can use Pydantic to validate our dictionary. So if someone supplies the improperly formatted data, we can check that to be sure that they aren't able to use it and mess anything up. So let's go ahead and make a new file. Back to our file explorer, we'll make a lookup file. It's going to be called cloud image files data.yaml, and we'll go back here and define that information. So I'm going to say cloud image files, and then we'll have the properties for our different distributions. So if we go back to main, here is our image base for Fedora. Let's go ahead and copy that over here, and I'll put that in the URL property. After that, I want to copy over this checksum file. We're going to need that. So we'll say checksum is this. And finally, the image file itself, I'm going to call image. And then we'll copy this image file. And there we go. This is the information for Fedora 40. But of course, I just have these base properties. That's not going to work out. We need to supply the code name. I'm going to say Fedora 40 is our code name or our image name. So let's indent this and make this a dictionary with these properties. Now I can supply additional ones like Ubuntu 2404 or Rocky 9.4 or what have you. I think I wanted a dash in here too. Now I also want you to be able to specify just Fedora and get the latest Fedora version. So to do that, we'll use a YAML anchor. I want to say it's going to be asterisk Fedora. And we need to define this anchor. So the anchor is going to be for Fedora 40. So I'm going to say and Fedora to define the anchor. So now Fedora is going to be whatever Fedora 40 is. And if Fedora 41 comes out, we'll just make Fedora 41 up here, get rid of this anchor, and move it to Fedora 41. So now we have our image files for both Fedora and Fedora 40. So let's see how we're going to make use of this YAML file. The first thing I'd like to do is make a Pydantic model for this file. So let's go to our terminal and make sure we have Pydantic. So poetry add Pydantic. And I've already added it, but if you hadn't, we need to do that right now. So since we have Pydantic installed, let's go back to our Python file and create a Pydantic model. So we'll say from Pydantic import base model. We'll make a new class. This will be the cloud image files model, and it is going to inherit from base model. And inside here we have one primary key, this cloud image files. So we'll have that. And this is a dictionary of strings to cloud image properties. So we need to go ahead and define those. Let's go ahead and import that. So from typing import dictionary. And we'll make this new class, cloud image properties model, which will inherit from base model. And then here we have three properties. We have a URL, a checksum, and an image. So there's a URL, which is a string type. There is the checksum, which is a string type. And there is an image, which again is a string type. But we can do better on our validation. So there should be an HTTP URL type in Pydantic, and we can say that the URL must be HTTP URL. That way we'll have something that looks like this. Now, whether it's valid, well, we can't really check that, but at least we'll know that the data looks good. So everything in here should be good for our Pydantic model. Now that we have that, I want to go ahead and read our data into our class. So let's make a class property for this. Let's say cloud image files, which is going to be a cloud image files model. And we're going to start it out as being none. We will get that if we don't have it inside the run method. I only want to read this data from file one time. So let's make a class method to read in these cloud image files. So we'll say this is going to be a class method, and we're going to define it as load class image files. So first thing I want to say is it needs a class property, so let's give it that. And we'll say if class.cloudImageFiles is none, then we will assign this information. Otherwise, we don't need to do that. We only need to read this data from file one time. Future John here with a quick clarification. Because of the way Ansible dynamically creates these lookup modules, this won't always prevent the file data from being read more than once. It does help sometimes, but not every time. Just wanted to clarify that. Let's get back to it. So let's start by reading in some YAML data. So let's go ahead and import YAML to read that. And then down here, I want to put in a try block. So we're going to be opening this file. So let's define our file name. So file name is going to be cloudimagefiles.yaml. And actually, I moved this file over into a data subdirectory, so it should be in here. So inside our try block, I want to say with open file name for reading as f. We're going to read in the data. So we'll say data equals yaml.safe_load from this file. And we'll give some exceptions. So there could be an I/O error. If we get an I/O error, that means we couldn't read this file for some reason. So we're going to need to raise an exception at that point. So let's just raise some kind of Ansible error, and we'll give it an F string and say unable to load cloud image files data from, and we'll give it the file name. Okay, so that looks pretty good in there. Now there's one other error we might run into, and it's going to be a yaml.yaml error, and that would be, we would get that if we didn't have valid YAML in our file. So this time we're going to raise another Ansible error, and we'll say unable to parse YAML from file name. Okay, that should be good at this point. If we made it here, we should have data from our file. All we have to do now is turn it into a Pydantic model. So to do that, we're going to say class.cloudImageFiles, and that's going to equal cloud image files model, and we'll just simply give it the data properties. Now I want a try block in here as well because we might have a validation error. So let's put that in a try block, and let's say except, let's load a validation error from Pydantic. There we go. So we'll say except validation error, and we'll raise an Ansible error there as well. And we'll say unable to validate cloud image file data in file name. We might want to get the actual error as well. So let's do that. We'll say as E. We can give it another property saying original exception equals E. And this will give our error more context for why this failed. So it should tell us exactly why we didn't have valid data if we don't. Okay, that all looks pretty good at this point. Assuming we did not have an exception, we should have the cloud image file data loaded into this variable. If you were paying attention, you might have noticed we used a relative path here. And you might be thinking, relative to where? And that's a good question because the answer is not inside the directory that we need it to be. So we're going to need to find out what directory we are in inside this file. So to do that, I'm going to use the dunder file property with the pathlib to resolve the actual path. So let's go ahead and import pathlib. And then we'll go ahead and say, rather than getting the file name as being this, we're going to say it's pathlib.path, and we're going to get the path of the file object. That's whatever path we are in this Python file. But I don't want that path. I want its parent directory. And I need to resolve that into a path object so I can concatenate it with the rest of my path. So I'll say it is with data and with this cloud image files. So that looks good for our file name. So now we shouldn't have any problem with the absolute path of our file name. I made a couple of quick changes to the names. So the method for loading the cloud images is now just called load cloud images. Our dictionary is called cloud images, and we return the cloud images property there rather than the cloud images model, because we have this outside key here, but we don't actually want it. I just want the dictionary that's inside this top level key. So let's go ahead and go down to our run method and make sure that loader is called. So let's load our cloud images to make sure we get the data from that file. So assuming we had no error, we should have our data and can move on. The user will supply a list of terms. We want to make sure they only supplied one. So we can't work with 0. I don't want to work with more than 1. So let's say we have a count of the terms, which is the length of the terms array. And if the terms count is not equal to 1, we'll raise an exception. So let's do raise Ansible lookup error. We'll give this an F string. Expected exactly 1 image name, received X number. Okay, so now we know we have exactly 1 count. So let's go ahead and say the image name is the first term in the array, which should be the only term in the array. And now I want to make sure that this image name property actually exists in our cloud images dictionary. So let's say if image name is not in self.cloudimages, we need to raise an Ansible lookup error here as well. Unable to find image name. Okay, so in theory, we actually have an image that's in our data. So we can continue. So our image properties, cloud images for the image name. Now, I don't want to return these image properties. We could, and that would work, but then the user would still have to concatenate the URL with a checksum file and do a couple other minor things. I'd like to make it more convenient. Let's just go ahead and add these together automatically inside our plugin. So to do that, let's start by creating a dictionary. So I'm going to call it image, and the image is going to be an object where we have the checksum URL and the image URL. And these are going to both be F strings of the image properties URL and then the image properties checksum. And here again, it's going to be image properties URL and then the image properties dot image. Okay, that looks pretty good. We need to quote these names. They are strings. It's not YAML here. Let's see, what else do we need? This file name is actually fine, but it might not be if a distribution chose not to end their file name with the .qcode2 extension. Proxmox doesn't always interpret different extensions as qcode2 files. So let's handle that as well. Let's create a file name property. So let's say file name equals image properties dot image, and if not file name dot ends with dot qcode2, we're just going to add that. So let's say file name plus equals dot qcode2. So whatever file they give us, if it doesn't end in the extension .qcode2, we're going to say add that. Let's go ahead and add this file name property as well. So the file name is going to be the file name. Okay, there is our image. Now you can see that they made an array to return. We don't need to construct an array as we go because we're not putting multiple things. We're returning exactly one thing. But we do have to return an array, even though we're only returning a single thing each time. So what we want to do is return an array of the image dictionary we just created. And all of this, we don't need to do any of it. So let's just go ahead and cut all of that. And let's go ahead and clean up some of our stuff. We don't use this error. We don't use this import. We don't use the display. We could have, but we didn't. Yeah. I think that looks pretty good. Let's go test our plugin and see if it works. I have made some modifications to the create PV host playbook. So here's our test plugin. We're using the debug module to do a message. And our message is looking up the cloud image properties. So we're going to look up the sysng quick Proxmox cloud image. Remember, that's what I renamed the lookup plugin to. And the cloud image looking up is Fedora 40. This is how we use our lookup plugin. I'm going to go ahead and do a fail here because, well, the rest of our code is still broken, so it won't work. But let's just stop right here and not try and do anything else. Let's see if any of that works. We'll go to the terminal, and let's run Ansible playbook, sysng quick tutorial create PV host, and see what we get. Hey, that looks pretty good. Checksum URL looks like the full path to the checksum. File name looks pretty good. It ends in Qcode 2. That is okay. Image URL, yeah, it's the entire image URL. So yeah, I think this plugin is working as we expect. Now that our plugin appears to work, let's make use of it inside our cloud image role. We could define a variable with setFact, but I like to avoid setFact when possible because it's very high in variable precedence and very long-lived. We only need this variable inside this role. So let's attach some vars inside this block instead. And we can do so with just a vars keyword. So let's say that the var I want to define is called image. And to get this image, we're going to look up our custom plugin, which is sysng-quick.proxmox.cloudImage. And then we need to supply our cloud image name, which is a variable in our role. So that should be cloud image name. Okay, so now we'll have the image property in any of these block tasks. So we need to replace any of the old variables we removed, like the cloud image URL checksum. So instead, this should be image of checksum URL. Let's go ahead and copy this. And where else do we need to replace? This file is no longer right. It should be file name. This cloud image URL is now image URL. And down here, again, this should be file name. And I think that might be everything. I'm not seeing anything else right now. So this looks pretty good. So why don't we try it out and see what happens? Let's go back to create PVE role and see what we have in here. The one thing that might stand out is we have this file name right over here we need to pass to a different section. We'll fix that in a minute, but let's make sure our plugin works first. Let's go back to our terminal and let's rerun the create PV host playbook. And okay, our plugin worked as expected. We haven't defined the Ubuntu image yet, and that is the default we selected. Let's go ahead and add that property. So inside, we've got the cloud image dest. We need cloud image name, which is going to be Fedora. Okay, try that one more time. Yeah, it passed all of the cloud image tasks, so I'm thinking this all looks pretty good. Okay, let's go ahead and fix this hard-coded file property. Obviously, I don't want this in here. I just spent a long time replacing this so we wouldn't have any hard-coded names. So let's go ahead and say we'll change this file property to a name property. And I'll go ahead and put Fedora here. But that gets a bit awkward too. I'm supplying the name here and here. Wouldn't it be easier if I could supply a single variable? Well, I don't know if there's a great way to do this, but here's one technique I like to use. I like to create a property that starts with global underscore. And I'll say cloud image name here, and we'll say this is Fedora. And I'm going to go ahead and cut both of these properties right here. So let's go ahead and move back into the defaults for our cloud image role. So our default for cloud image name is Ubuntu. But instead of doing that, what I'm going to do is say I would like it to be the global cloud image name, or we'll default to Ubuntu if we don't have one. Okay, so now we still have our same default, but if we supply this global cloud image name, it will take that as the default. Let's go ahead and change that in the other section as well. I've started by updating the argument spec to replace the file property with the name property. It no longer is required because we have a default value of Ubuntu, and I copied the choices from the other argument spec. I'm not sure if there's a good way to share this data between the two places. If you know, leave me a comment. but I'm not sure how best to do that right now, so I've just copied it. Let's go ahead and go into the defaults file. So here in our var's main file, here's our disk image properties, and now we're going to have a name property, and the default here is going to be Ubuntu, as I said it would be. But again, we don't want this to be necessarily the default. We want it to be like our other default. So we're going to copy over the cloud image name and place it like this instead. So now the default will be Ubuntu if we don't specify anything, but if we give it a global cloud image name, it will default to Ubuntu. Okay, now we have all the right properties defined, but it doesn't know how to actually use this in the cloud VM. So let's go ahead and fix that. In our create VM role task, we use the file property right here. Now we can't use the name property because that does not make sense. So instead, let's go ahead and add another var to this section down here. So again, under var, we're going to create an image property, and we're going to use our Lookup plugin, syseng quick, Proxmox, cloud image, and the property is going to be this name property inside here. Let's go ahead and copy that entire thing and replace this with name. And there is our image property. So we replace this value section with image, and it is the file name. And that should be good for our image file. Okay. So that looks pretty good. Let's go ahead and try that out. Back in the terminal, we'll go ahead and run the tutorial again. Looks okay, but it didn't do anything because it didn't have to create a new VM. So this may still be wrong. Let's go ahead and change the name to make sure it creates a new VM. Let's go back to our playbook, and we'll call it proxy2, and then run it one more time. Yeah. Everything seems to work fine, so I think we have refactored this properly. Before we go, I want to spend a minute talking about the setFact module. Hey, didn't I just say setFact was bad? It creates variables that have high precedence and they're long-lived. Why don't I replace this with a block section? Well, the answer is we could, and it wouldn't really be a problem here. But there are some differences between the way setFact works and regular variables work. So if I have a var section and I have something in here, when is the contents of this variable evaluated? The answer is every single time we reference that variable. This means this lookup is being called anytime we use the image property. Now, that's only once over here, so it doesn't really matter. But over in Cloud Image, we used it here, and here, and here, and down here. You know, that's 4 times. Does that matter? Well, not really. This is a very fast operation. It's basically a dictionary lookup, so not really a big deal. But it could matter in certain situations. Now, setFact differs from that, because setFact looks up whatever you put in this variable and then assigns that value to the fact. It doesn't assign this Jinja expression. It assigns the output of this Jinja expression. So if this were an expensive operation, which this, is more expensive lookup plugin, but not significantly, we might spend another second running this playbook if we put it in a var section, but it would not be noticeable to anyone. But it is a concern. So if you're worried about that, like the speed of your lookups, that might be a concern. If you have a very expensive lookup, you might want to use setFact versus putting it in a var section. The other reason you might want to do that is, what if the contents of your Jinja expression change? Is that possible? Well, over here, we use setFact to do Proxmox VMID, and we store the result of VMID. Well, why not just use result VMID? Well, that's fine, but I pretty much always use result as my register variable, and that's a fairly common practice. So the result variable is being trampled all the time. You do not want to rely on the output of a register variable that you use a generic name for, like result. If you need a value from that, set a fact immediately after getting your result registered. That way you can be sure that Proxmox VMID actually equals the VMID and not whatever is looked up at the time this variable is referenced. So that's the other big difference between setFact and why you may want to use that. Again, for us here, neither one matters. I just wanted to highlight some of the differences. I didn't realize the refactoring of the Lookup plugin would take quite this much time. I was hoping to make the Action plugin today as well, but I think we'll cut things here and save that for next time. I hope you found this information useful. If you did, please hit those like and subscribe buttons. It really helps out the channel and I appreciate it. Thanks for watching. See you next time.